Hello, humans. This is a brief note that this episode was recorded towards the end of 2020, so you will hear Ben make some references to editing his book, The Unraveling, that are out of date at this point. Okay, cue the music.
Welcome to the podcast. Mohnraj and Rosenbaum are humans. It's Marianne Mohnraj, Ben Rosenbaum, and our ongoing editorial guest, Jed Hartman, who we are trying to talk into becoming almost a co-host. We'll see how that goes.
But he's already almost a co-host. He hasn't managed to escape yet. He may escape our clutches at some point.
We're delighted to have him here because today we're going to talk about editing and specifically workshopping, which he and I have done a lot of together, sometimes with Ben, primarily in person. So that's going to be kind of the focus of what we do today. I was thinking it was sort of workshopping, the good, the bad, the ugly, where workshops are helpful, where they can go terribly, terribly wrong, horrible workshop experiences we've had. My worst workshop experience was actually in my first writing workshop. I was a college student at the University of Chicago. I graduated, but I was working at the university at the time as a secretary. And on my lunch break, I took a grad student at large creative writing class, fiction writing. I was really excited to take it. And it was my first fiction writing class. And the teacher, and I've blanked out his name. It has been lost to the mists of history. Was horrible,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
in a way that we didn't realize for a long time. But by the end of the semester, it had become clear that he only liked work by boys. And so the boys in the class, their pieces would get a lot of praise from him, and the girls in the class got only critique. And I almost didn't realize it, but by the end of the course, it had happened enough times that we were all talking about it. And the guys were not happy about it either, right?
Yeah.
It was like, we're all being cheated of actually useful critique because of this guy's biases. So that was very frustrating and almost put me off workshopping entirely for a long time. But I'm glad I came back to it.
So are we focusing entirely on workshops? There was also some discussion of talking about writing advice, common writing advice, and what.
I think they all interweave. Yes.
Okay, go ahead, Ben.
So,
my thought was that we should do workshops with an emphasis today, because I don't think this is our first podcast episode about workshops, actually, or the first time you told that story. But
really? It was such a frustrating story.
You told it in more detail this time. And editing is a thing. But I thought that it would be good today to have an emphasis on sort of the traditions of workshopping and the writing, the sort of the ethos of workshopping, and also kind of like the writing advice that comes out of workshopping, and talking about sort of specific like maxims or old saws or proverbs that have arisen. And I think I know I've talked about in earlier episodes sort of how to approach critique, like how to take. I think I have. For one thing, I trust I've said the opposite of a good critique is usually a good critique. Like that's one of my favorites. So I think we sort of talked about like how we definitely had a conversation about how you don't listen to everyone, don't run around fixing all the problems, try to figure out what is good try to express when critiquing what to revise towards, what you think the piece is doing, what the soul of the piece is. And when you're getting advice, try to figure out who it worked for and who it, as well as who it didn't, and try to see how what are the thinking about it, not as like the people who didn't like it are telling you all the problems with it that you need to fix, but rather like the people who didn't like it, there was some barrier to their having the experience that the people who did like it did have, and what barrier is that, and can it be removed without breaking the experience of the people who did like it. So anyway, I think we covered a lot of that, and I thought that it would be good to talk about the different critiques of workshops, the nuts and bolts of like how to find a workshop, and maybe also the framing of like writing advice, which is partly linked to that tradition, and what we think about it. Because I have lots to say about various pieces of writing advice and why, and that they are both useful but also potentially confining.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's worth saying, one last introductory thing is that there's definitely at least two different traditions of workshopping. Marianne, you could probably speak to this more, but I think there is like the academic tradition of like creative writing classes in college and in MFA programs. I don't have any experience of MFA programs, but I did have not quite as disastrous as the one you described, but I had I was not a huge fan of the creative writing classes that I had at university. But that's a whole tradition. But there is really, it feels like a parallel tradition, even though I guess it is partly housed at universities, but that like the Milford Clarion peer group tradition of
Right.
critiquing it very specific to science fiction and fantasy, although I think it's broad and beyond that to other parts of the world, is like its own thing in a way, its own ethos.
Yeah, maybe I can talk a little about the MFA and the undergraduate creative writing classroom, in part because it does really change the dynamic, not necessarily for the better, when there is a teacher and students, right? And I'll give as an example. When I first started teaching at one of my universities, you get observed as a teacher and you get feedback, right, as part of your job evaluation process. So the head of my program came and watched me run a workshop, and she gave me a piece of advice afterwards that I'm still not entirely sure I agree with. I had done it essentially kind of Clarion style, and we went around the room. Each student spoke for about 3 minutes, giving feedback. They also did written feedback. And I went last, but I just sort of gave my feedback as if I were another writer, right? And she said that my job as the teacher was to do more of commenting on sort of like what the other students had said, synthesizing it all, making clear what was useful, what was not useful, etc. And
I wonder how you would know what was useful.
Certainly not. Well, presumably, I think her assumption was that as the teacher, of course I would know, right? I have, I wouldn't get the job if I did not know. And that I wouldn't limit myself to 3 minutes. Like, I think her model expected me to be speaking for quite a bit longer than the other writers in the room, right?
Yeah.
So I think I've ended up with sort of a hybrid of that.
Yeah.
I don't do really what she does, but I do try, or what she suggested. And it's possible, this was a very quick evaluation. It's possible that I've misunderstood or misrepresented what she was trying to say to me. But where I end up is I do try to synthesize a little bit when I do my critique now. And it's part of why it's really important that I go last. And so that is there is a hierarchy of some sense, but not necessarily a power hierarchy. I don't know what to call it, like a structural hierarchy, that I'm approaching the story and the class workshop dynamic in a different way than as if I were just another writer in the room. Like, it's also my job to be the teacher. And part of that is trying to teach them what is useful workshopping. I don't know, to like highlight, what I'm like. I'll often say things like, this is what I heard some of your classmates saying, and I thought that was very strong because of blah or whatever else. So I don't know, Jed, you've seen me workshop a lot, and you've seen my workshopping evolve over time too. So I don't know if you.
Yeah. So I think that what you just described is the way that you do it, and you do it extremely well. I think that the synthesis part is extremely useful. I think that during Clarion, I think I occasionally felt like it was just the workshopping sessions were just a matter of waiting until the teacher said, the true answer. Not always, but I think that there was, for me, sometimes a dynamic where that was the important opinion in the room. And I think that the synthesizing that you do bypasses that problem, that flaw.
It's also Sorry, I was just going to say, like, I think that in part is a problem with the Clarion model in terms of the size of the class, in that, there's typically around 17 writers. So that's a lot of feedback, right? And that's a
Yeah.
lot of like 3-minute responses. And, we've been talking about setting up something Clarion-like in Chicago, but I don't think I would have the classes that big. In my creative writing classroom, we max it at 15, but I think it's a better workshop in the sort of 8 to 10 range. So, one thing I've been thinking about doing is having 2 classes basically running at the same time and that are held to that size, maybe 8 students each,
Yeah.
that are workshop cohorts. We could then come together for broader discussions of craft or business or whatever else. So anyway, sorry.
So I guess I would say that another aspect of this is a hierarchy not so much of power as of experience, and that you are, when I've seen you lead a workshop session, when you are like the leader of the session, you are bringing tools and background to that critique that a lot of the people who are in the studentish role are don't have, and you're looking at the story in a way that they are not necessarily looking at it. And as I may have said here before in other discussions of critiques, these days my approach to critiquing is to ask myself, what would Marianne do? Because I find that a much more effective, when there is somebody who is in charge of the session, or leading the session, I find that a much more effective approach than the way that I used to do things.
I sort of want to come down on the other side of this, because what I was going to say is sort of the opposite of this, that what I find so striking about Clarion, I mean, you did say, you started out before you got the feedback from your evaluator in a more Clarion mode. And that was for me, I do not remember. I mean, my God, we had Octavia Butler in the room. Like, obviously, like, it was on the one hand, like I would have been a natural reaction to be like, well, this is the voice of God, and the rest of these are just,
I'm thinking like
randos.
her words fell on your ears like drops of molten gold. They burned, but yeah, no, sorry.
But in fact, that's not what the structure promoted, and that's not what Octavia radiated. And actually, I think it was a far more profound experience to have something that was structured very much like a peer critique group, in which everyone got their 3 minutes, and then the author got time, and then there was a discussion, and simply have a group of 17 peers all sitting down in an egalitarian fashion, and one of them was Octavia fucking Butler. I mean, that is a much more radical and profound experience, and because that set me up post Clarion to walk into a workshop, a peer workshop, ready to listen to everybody like they're Octavia Butler. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with that. I think,
it's not a class.
Yeah.
I wasn't, it's not the same thing.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you should have. I'm not saying you should have, ripped your evaluator's evaluation out of her hand, tore it up, and stomped on it, and said no, Clarion forever.
But so one way to think about this is, so I've been in a lot of workshops, right? And I've, like, when I was in Salt Lake City, I was working I was teaching like freshman comp. I really missed the creative writing world. And I set up a workshop with some other random people I met who were also writing science fiction, right? So we met once a month. This is a super common experience, right? We met once a month and we tried to give each other feedback, and they were lovely people. But I would say that for the most part, they responded to stories the way readers would. That was the kind of feedback I got from them. I've been in other workshops, and that was useful feedback, right? And I still send out stories to people who I want them to respond as readers, but I also know that's what I'm getting from them. I've also seen people who respond as writers, and I've seen people who respond really more as editors, and I've seen people who respond as teachers. And I think those are like 4 different modes. And
I like that.
And when I'm actually teaching class and responding as a teacher, it is less about improving the individual piece of writing generally than about trying to get them to make the shift from responding as readers to responding as writers, because it's often freshmen, sophomores who are very brand new to all of this, and they like much of the semester starts off with them saying, well, I really like this, and that's their response, and it's getting them off of the I like this
Sure.
response.
It's funny that you call it readers and writers, though. It's funny that you call it readers and writers, though. Yes, if what you mean by is people who, it sounds like you're using, maybe I'm wrong, it sounds like you're using reader to mean people who don't have much experience at a workshop and therefore say, I like this, and writers people who know how to critique. But what's funny?
I mean, they're giving different kinds of responses. Like when I say reader, I mean they tend to give the response that's about sources of reader pleasure, which, as I said, it's like valuable information to have, but it's about where they're finding enjoyment, right?
I guess the failure mode. I don't travel in circles where I end up with a lot. I mean, you're teaching students, right? You're talking about 19-year-olds. I have not sat with many 19-year-olds in a room, so we have very different experiences. What I find as a failure mode.
Yeah.
What I find as a failure mode when I walk into a random, like, let's go to a random critique at a critique group at a con, right? And it doesn't work, and they're no good at it. The way that they're failing is not being enough readers and being too much writers. The typical failure mode that I encounter is where somebody is telling me how they would do it.
Yes.
And I'm like, can you back up from how you would do it and tell me what you read? Like, I just want to know what your experience was. That's the most valuable thing, right? I can't read it as anyone else.
So when I talk about responding as writers, I don't mean responding as like, this is how I would write the story. That is clearly a failure mode and a problem, right? Yeah. And you do see that a lot. But I mean in the sense of being able to talk about aspects of craft, which for me is something that I have to bring some of my students along to that. Being able to talk about, well, this bit was confusing. Let's look at point of view shifts and what the writer's doing here. And they're not cueing their point of view shifts clearly, and that's why several of you kind of fell off the cliff and got lost in the story, right? So being able to have that kind of concrete craft discussion, when I'm responding as a teacher, a lot of what I'm doing is working on that rather than the individual story.
I don't know. This is a funny analogy, but you know how there are people who believe that scientific theories are like out there in the world. And, it actually is the case that like masses attract each other, to the square of their inverse square of their distance, and etc. And there are people who believe like, well, we've had a bunch of observations, and then we can compress those into theories, which are just like, it's a more modest way of looking at natural laws. Like, this is like, maybe it's not like inherent in the universe. It's just like, this is a good pattern that we've seen. And this math compresses what we've seen down to this very easily manageable form that you can practically use. So I sort of feel like the kind of same thing. Like when yes, I like it when people have writerly tools. I like it when someone can say, well, I think it was the POV throwing me off. But on some level, that's always a summary and shorthand. Because maybe it wasn't the POV, so you know what I mean? Like, in a way, I'm listening for what their experience was.
So we've run into this many times between you and me, and I don't disagree with you. This is like, we've had this conversation in different forms about different things. You're very resistant to this sort of idea of these rules and coming up with them and what's useful about them. I do think that there can be a lot of floundering.
Sure.
And having these are
exactly
can get you through that. It can lead you in bad directions too. I mean,
but my analogy,
no doubt.
I think my analogy works pretty well, because if you don't have any way to calculate the gravitational force between two masses, then there will be a lot of floundering. Like, you won't be able to operate effectively because you don't have a shorthand and where you could be like, oh, well, here's the math, like that. Right. I would expect this. But if you have decided that Newtonian mechanics is like written by God in the sky and there's no other alternative because it's the eternal truth, you're never going to come up with relativity, right? So there's a way in which it's like, it's useful to approach everything as like, this is a shorthand this is an approach that has worked for many people and like will save you a lot of time.
Sure.
And also be aware that You
Yes,
know,
but I would say that at the start of the semester and then wouldn't need to harp on it every class after that, right? Like,
sure,
this is
sure,
just a
sure.
framework. I take it as a given, right?
I think it's
So,
also worth noting that different writers need different things from different critiques for different
Right,
works, and
yeah.
right.
and that it can be really important to have some idea of what this particular writer needs from you for this particular work.
Mhm.
And again, like I'm not in a room with a bunch of undergraduate students. Like that's not right.
Mhm.
I mean, we're not. This isn't
And
the
to say
same context. Like I'm not
right.
right.
And I will say, like, in any standard class of 15, there are a couple of them who are already operating the way my classmates at Clarion typically operated, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's not like
Right. It's
they're
not really an age thing because
no,
there was like
right.
18 year
Yeah.
olds in my Clarion class who were amazing. Like it's more like have they.
But a
Yeah.
lot of them have not had anyone model for them how to talk about the
Yes.
stories in a craft way, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
And
Right.
um,
and I think that I think it's worth my throwing in my experience here. So I did a couple of workshops in college, and then immediately after college, I went to Clarion. And the first week of Clarion, I was the only one who had any critiquing experience, and everyone, all of the other students, said, "Yeah, this is good. I like it," and that was their critique. And I said, and I was
Huh.
tearing things apart. And
Yeah.
by week 2, they had started to pick up some of ways to talk about things. And by week 6, I was the one who was going, "Oh, yeah, this is really good. I like it." And they were saying, "No, tear it apart." But I say this as prelude to saying that for the next 6 years, I did workshops, and I did workshops in the same way during all that time that I had done at Clarion and before. And it wasn't a good approach to workshopping. I had not learned um, I had not learned to think in terms of what would be useful to the writer. And so I would do things like I would mark up every page of the story with a combination of, big story problems and typos. And then
Mm.
mhm.
during the workshop, I would read aloud everything that was on every page of
Right.
my written up thing. And
Yeah.
it
You
was
have a missing
completely, it was a
comma
waste of
here.
time. It was a waste of everyone's time. And then
Well,
I
and
met
it's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
Marianne.
and not even just a waste of time, right? It's actively counterproductive. So this is something I learned in my master's program in my composition pedagogy class. So we were applying it to essays, but I think it applies to fiction as well, which is there's a lot of research in composition pedagogy about how students respond to their teachers' comments, right? And one thing they talked, I mean, there's sort of minor but interesting things like if you actually use a red pen to mark things up, students engage less in revision than if you use a blue pen, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there is a certain like they take it as criticism rather than critique and
Right.
shut down, right? But but more interesting to me, I thought, was about how much feedback you give, and if you give them too many things to work on, a lot of people will get overwhelmed by that, right? I'm not
Hmm.
going to say everyone, but if there's like 10 major things wrong with their essay and you tell them all of those things,
Yeah. You
that's a
may just
lot
break
to
them.
try and fix at once, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what I tend to do now with composition papers is I say like, okay, these are my goals for this paper, like I want you to have a clear argumentative thesis, right?
Hmm.
And I say this, it is currently Sunday before finals week, so tomorrow I will start getting a slew of papers we'll see how the semester has gone and whether they've learned any of this. But I want you to have a clear argumentative thesis, and I want you to back it up with at least 3 pieces of solid data, quotes from the text, followed by analysis, right? Like that's the goal. But then when I get their papers, I'm like, okay, well, they have messed up on all of these. I am now going to choose what I think is the most important thing for them to work on next. I will focus my comments on that at the end of their paper. And then I may note like 2 other things for the future, but in your revision, I want you to work on this. I mean, that's a very
But that is obviously
scaffolded way of approaching it, right?
right.
So,
But there's also obviously a gauging of who you're talking to. Like I would
Yeah.
be irritated if I thought that you were giving me a critique and you held back 5 things because you thought that 10 was too many, right?
would you?
So you're sort of wondering. Sort of the issue is like how much resilience has this person developed to be able to pick through a bunch of feedback and find and decide what's useful. right?
But another piece of it.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, Jad, go ahead.
Well, I think I may disagree with you on this, Marianne, but,
No, it's okay.
I think that another piece of it is prioritizing. I think that if you start with the most important things, if you start with saying, here's what I think your story is trying to do, and here is what I think that you should do with the shape of the story to do that more effectively, I think that then you can give a list of 100 typos if you want to, but it's possible that the person is going to throw out everything they wrote and start over again.
But that's kind of a different. But that's different. That's saying I have this second piece of advice which is no longer relevant if you follow my first piece of advice. So.
But even in setting that aside, I think that giving that most important piece of advice up front is much more useful than giving them a list of 30 things, of which the most important thing is buried on page 12.
I mean, I could also, it's not holding back because of resilience. I think you're misunderstanding me. Like, it's not that I think you're not a strong enough writer. I just think this is part of the nature of revision and human response, right? Like, I don't think you get to be immune to this just because you're a great writer or experienced in workshopping and critiquing. So if you read something of mine, let's say, like, you guys are going to read something of mine and give me feedback. I don't want every thought you have about what would make the story better. I actually only really want for my next draft, and this is partly because I see it as an iterative process, right?
Yeah.
So for my next draft, tell me the top 3 things and mark the priority and let me work on that. And then we'll come back to it again. And maybe I'll ask you again or somebody else, right?
I mean, it depends a lot on the context because, of course, if we're going to have 5 conversations about it, then we don't need to talk about everything at once. If I'm going to a workshop and this is like it's a relatively scarce resource, like I'm only going to be able to go through a couple of rounds of critiquing on this because I want high throughput. Like, I'm not going to spend more, like it's an extensive like getting a bunch of people together to critique a thing is an expensive proposition. I've managed to a couple of times a year get 5 people together. Obviously, obviously prioritization is fine. And obviously there's also a distinction between saying there's a comma missing on page 5, but you're probably going to forget page 5 anyway. But it would be frustrating if, like, right? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure where that, do you find my critiques overwhelming? Because we may actually be saying the same thing in different words, but, like, do I inundate you with too much to change?
No.
I guess I would have the same question because I don't.
No, I don't find Ben's critiques overwhelming, but I can imagine a Ben critique that could be overwhelming, I guess. Now, overwhelming is really not the right word. I mean, think how to articulate this, right?
So I'm not doing this thing consciously that you're doing. What is the effect of my not doing it on you is my question. I don't want to, you're right. Oh, maybe overwhelming is biasing it.
But I think, I guess I would say you're a pretty good critiquer for me.
Am I doing it? Maybe I am doing it and I don't know what to call it.
No, but I think you don't. I think you mostly, if I think to the things that you've read of mine, the way you respond tends to be focused on, 1 or 2 things that are significant, right? And that you think I need to work on. And you may jot down other things, but I think it's generally pretty clear which are the main things that have caught your attention.
Yeah. So I am doing the same thing.
You are doing the same thing.
I am doing the thing you're describing. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's really about prioritizing.
Yeah, I think it's about prioritizing, and I think and I guess when I talk to my students about this, I talk about it also as stages in terms of developmental editing versus copy editing versus proofreading, right? And
I mean, I definitely do that. I definitely do want to know from context, are you like, is this just like a very first draft and we're moving huge pieces around and then I'm really not paying attention to typos? Or, like, do you really expect to send this out next week? And then, like, then it's a lot about polishing. Like, that, of course, is very important, what stage the thing is at.
Yeah. So I think, anyway, so maybe we've come to an agreement.
But
I guess what happens in workshops a lot is people do. I do see students and writers in peer workshops who flatten that all out and give all the different kinds of feedback at once.
And
I guess the thing I would highlight for anyone who's teaching a workshop is or teaching a freshman composition class, it's particularly problematic to mark up the errors in the way of, you can imagine, like, your elementary school English teacher who, like, my high school English teacher would draw with a little red drop of blood on every punctuation or grammar error. She said she was weeping tears of blood.
Oh my God.
And she would stop reading at the third one and grade you on what you'd done so far. So that was super effective in terms of after the first paper, we all made sure that there were no punctuation and grammar errors going forward, right? Like we proofed and proofed and proofed before we handed them in. So I'm not saying that's a bad pedagogical technique if that's your goal, but
but then that's what everyone's attention is on.
But that's what
and it may be way too early in the process for their attention to be on proofreading. Like you don't really want somebody to compose something by first of all thinking where the commas are.
And my students are, they're busy, they're stressed. A lot of them, I teach at a state school, a lot of them are not personally invested in the class, or, they're taking it to fulfill a requirement, right? They're engineers, or, they're going into nursing or whatever. They do not care about the material or the paper at all, right? And so in that framework, they want to correct. They don't want to revise. So when if I give them a paper that is marked up with the teacher's markings, and I ask them for a revision, overwhelmingly what they will do is they will fix those errors I've marked and hand it back to me as a revision. So I don't actually get a revision if I mark up the paper. And I think that's really important because there's an added weight if you have a teacher, but I do think some of that, so I think teachers have to be especially careful about that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think even in peer-to-peer workshopping, that happens a lot, is that people will fix the errors and then never go in to rethink and revise. So, okay, sorry, I had a lot to say about that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I totally, I think another part of that, and we've said this before too. I feel like we should inflect in a moment to stuff that we definitely know we haven't said in an earlier episode. But I will say one thing that we may have said in an earlier episode, which is the focus on what's wrong with the text is often misleading as a critiquer. Like if you're like, this was wrong and this was wrong and this was wrong, you're not actually doing a lot of the job of a critiquer, which is to say, this is what I think this is about. This is what moved me. This is what's interesting about it, because that also is stuff the writer can't necessarily see. And the writer doesn't necessarily know how to articulate what they're trying to do. And one of the best things a critiquer can do is to be like, this is why this was exciting. And here's where you pissed me off because it lost that. Here's where I was really excited for this to happen. And then where do I go over here? You know what I mean? Like that, the critique of like where this failed me is useful in the context of like, this is what I wanted it. Not what I want it to be in the sense of like, well, if I was writing it, I would write about this. But like this is what I got excited about in this text, and what was then in the way of that enjoyment, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of my favorite kind of critique. Yes.
And I think that another piece of that is well, maybe this might segue into your advice. I have sometimes heard critiquing advice that says always find something positive to say, and often I see less experienced critiquers do things like, I love the font here, because they were told that they had to say something nice and they couldn't think of anything nice to say. And one of the things that Marianne taught me about critiquing is that there is pretty much always something good and useful and interesting going on in any given piece. If you look for it with that frame of mind, and if you think about the multitude of different things that could be done well, and I think that what you were just saying is maybe just another framing of that same idea, that there's something exciting here. What is it, and how can I talk about what that thing is that I want them to work more on?
And sorry, I'll just say, when Jed was talking about the tear it apart style of critiquing that I did see a lot at Clarion and have seen in other workshops, I wanted to highlight that it can be very performative, right? There's a social dynamic that comes into this, that like, let me show you what a good writer I am, or how smart I am. Sometimes
or how funny I am.
How funny I am, right? Like, because I can essentially it can slide over into mockery if you're not careful, right? Like I'm gonna show you everything that's wrong with this story, and I will be amusing, and the whole room will be laughing,
right?
And that's not helpful. That's not why anybody's here, right? So thinking a little bit about like, almost like there's the destructive critique. You want to really avoid that. There's the deconstructing style of critique, which is almost maybe neutral, like just kind of taking apart and looking at the pieces, and that can be helpful, right? And I think that's often what a critic will do, what an editor will do is kind of like, I'm going to like really, bear the skeleton of what's going on in this. And then there's the constructive, right? Like where you've had to do the deconstructing a little bit in your head, at least, to be able to do the constructing of like, okay, here are the most exciting things. This is where the piece is really working. This is what I think you're trying to do. And here's what's supporting that already. And maybe you could put a little more oomph into those sections, right? So,
and I think in general that I'm very wary of evaluative elements of critiquing where you're like this. I mean, some of that, of course, is evaluative. If it's sort of this, I was excited about this, I was less excited about this, obviously within the work. But to be like, this is really good, or this is, even to be like, I mean, it's not completely taboo to be like, oh, this is my favorite thing of yours, but it's not actually helpful. Like, what's somebody going to do with that? Like, as a meta thing of like, oh, I'd love to see you write more, you're great at dragons, write more dragons, maybe. But like, in terms of this work, like, this is great, this is not great. It's not, there's that great, I think I've talked about it before, this great Linda Berry cartoon about where she first starts to draw as a little kid, and it's like this jouissance of freedom. Then somebody compliments her, and immediately she's like asking about every time. Then later, it's like, is this one good too? Is this one good too? And eventually somebody reacts negatively, and then she's got like two things on her shoulder. Is it good? Does it suck? Is it good? Does it suck? And actually, that is poison to creativity, and you kind of want to get away from that. So really, I feel like whether I like love this story and would run out and buy it, or whether I absolutely hated it, I'm going to approach critiquing it the same way. Like, it's not interesting in a way. In a way, it's not really interesting where I would rank this among all possible stories. It's not actually that interesting. A story that I hated, I might still have found one thing I was really fascinated by, or one element, or like there is something like the voice of the protagonist was great, and then I want to talk about that and how, and what was interfering with my enjoyment of what that could have been is very different than just like than like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying I pretend to like it. It's just irrelevant whether I, at the end of the day, found it on a scale of 1 to 10, whatever. What's interesting is like, what was calling me here and what was blocking me from enjoying that,
on the evaluative note, I wanted to, have you run across Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke? Because I usually give this to my students. I'm going to read out just the.
Talk about this? Maybe not.
Did we talk about this?
Go ahead.
We may have.
I feel like a lot of this maybe.
I want to actually read out a piece of the letter. They're available
after
online.
After you do that, I feel like if we go to the City Lexicon, it will avoid us repeating what we've said on many other episodes.
Okay,
so let's do that next.
You ask whether your verses are any good. You ask me. You've asked others before this. You send them to magazines. You compare them with other poems, and you're upset when certain editors reject your work. Now, since you've said you want my advice, I beg you to stop doing that sort of thing. You are looking outside, and that is what you should most avoid right now. No one can advise or help you. No one. There is only one thing you should do. Go into yourself. Find out the reason that commands you to write. See whether it has spread its roots into the very depths of your heart. Confess to yourself whether you would have to die if you were forbidden to write. This, most of all, ask yourself in the most silent hour of your night, must I write? And then he goes on, and Rilke is quite intense. This is probably not useful for everyone, but I think I come back to it periodically because I live in a world where I do so much critiquing and so much, and I ask people for feedback, and I like the praise. I am the Linda Berry with the little do you like me? Do you really like me? Kind of thing, right? And so periodically I have to kind of be like, I need to shut all that down and go into the woods and just be with myself for a bit, right?
No one can help you. That is actually I wish there was more of that. I mean, I mean, it has to be balanced with listen to the interesting feedback you get. But I wish there was more attention on that. There's a thing of what you read. There's a thing actually that I love, and there's another thing that I find annoying. Not necessarily really in Rilke, but just it reminds me of something I find annoying. The thing that I love is this sense of no one can help you. At the end, you should be curious what other people read because you don't know what you wrote, because it happens in the brain of the reader. So it's useful and interesting. But on the other hand, nobody can give you ultimately that praise, that recognition that you ultimately you are alone before before the active composition. The thing that reminds me of something that annoys me, at least, is but do you have to write? But is it a true?
No, I agree. That was
because that's like a trope also in critiquing, and it comes in various forms. But this sort of piece of workshop lore that's like, if you could possibly do anything other than write, you should. And I'm like, no, I could do a million. What are you talking about? I loved acting. Like if somebody was like, you can't write, I'd be like, great, I'm going out for community theater. Like, you know what I mean? Like I have plenty of backup passions. Like it does not need, you do not need to be like, I would be crushed and in despair forever if I were unable to, it's like, no, if it's something you love, you should do things you love. But like, anyway.
I would say that's Rilke asking, like that's Rilke. First of all, that's like, just him.
Storm
and also
Drang.
He's trying to answer the question of like whether you should be a poet or not, which is it's a different question. And
whether you should be a poet is something. Often this was framed in the old days. In the old 3 cents a word would buy you, you could live on 3 cents a word especially if you like it reminds me of the old sort of bravado of the like, I type one story on each hand with 2 different manual typewriters, and I never look, I never revise, I never look back. I send them out in the manila envelopes, and John W. Campbell buys them. Like that sort of bravado was like, writing is too tough a life to make your living writing unless, you're destined for it, which is sort of like, well, come on. Like now we live in a very different economy. It's really not about like how many words you're gonna, you know what I mean? Like a lot of the way the writing that the industry works now is that like most people have a day job, and then like it's a power law distribution, right? Like some people become fantastically wealthy and then it drops off very quickly, and then there's a long tail of people who like maybe get to buy coffee, and like that is the reality. And to put a line somewhere and be like, well, if you're not on this side of the line, if you're destined for greatness, you'll end up, which is silly. Clearly, in my view, there are some people who are like Ted Chiang has a day job. Like there are clearly some people who were put on God's earth to write who do not make. I mean, well, now he made it. There was a movie, so now I guess Ted Chiang may be getting cash. But you know what I mean? Like, like if
I think Rilke's framing of it had nothing to do with money, right? Like,
no, I agree.
But yes,
I think there's right, but I in the non-high art, in the pulp tradition, there was this like, are you going to make it, meaning 3 cents a word, and in the romantic tradition Rilke's coming out of, there was like, are you a true poet, which is just like, I don't know, if you want to write poems, you're a poet.
But I think he kind of would agree. I'll read one other bit later in the poem where he says, out of this turning within, out of this immersion in your own world, poems come. Then you will not think of asking anyone whether they're good or not, nor will you try to interest magazines in these works, for you will see them as your dear natural possession, a piece of your life, a voice from it. A work of art is good if it has arisen out of necessity. That is the only way one can judge it. So he's involved in a very different project, right? In terms of kind of like,
sure. No, I mean, it's antithetical to the pulp tradition, but it still has this. I mean, anyway, I mean, necessity in that sense.
He's sort of saying like, don't look for people telling you whether it's good or not. Look for whether you feel called to write it, and whether you are honoring that inner voice. I think you're actually more on the same page with him than
I think that's a reasonable reading. That reading of, I mean, so what he means by necessity is not like, is there any other life you could be living? It's like, do
you feel an internal
thing that you actually should write, not the thing that you think will impress everybody else. You know what I mean? The thing that is actually coming.
And are you allowing yourself to hear that voice, right? Or is it getting drowned out by the critiquers? I actually think this is all super relevant to the subject of this, right? Because
there's a tension between that inner voice, because sometimes we've talked about this before too, and let's get to the list in a minute because I think we're repeating ourselves, but there is this tension. I do find I was brought up on this romantic ideal of the writer listening to their true inner voice and respecting their muse, and I think that it was in some ways destructive, because I think that there's another way to look at it, which is that it's this very interconnected kind of conversation, and you're not like this lonely genius. You're just like, there was this, I don't think I've said this before. I saw this great, there's this bit where I think it's like Jerry Seinfeld and Eddie Izzard. There's like Chris Rock. There's like a video somewhere on YouTube of like a bunch of stand-up comedians having a conversation, and they get onto the top. They're like sitting in a circle, and it's just they're all talking about like their lives in comedy, and they get at some point onto like, why did you want to be a comic, or like what pulled you toward it? And it's like, was it fame, or was it or whatever, the art form? I don't know. And I remember one of them, I don't know, maybe Jerry Seinfeld, saying like, I would go to these clubs when I was young, and I would watch these guys upstairs and these guys on the stage, and I was just like, I just want to be one of those guys. And that seems to me this very, like, I resonate a lot with that motivation, and it seems like a very pure motivation, and it's not. So that's not purely inward turning. That's not purely like the muse of stand-up comedy is speaking in me, and the world be disregarded. Even if no one ever heard me, I would stand alone on a stage and speak into a microphone in my stand-up comedy because the muse has called me. Like, it's not that. And it's also not like, oh, I want to impress everybody. I want applause. It's more like, I want to participate in this community. I want to be part of this conversation. I want to be contributed to and to contribute. And that is like the natural place for me to put this love, is like in interconnection. I am not the one great speaker genius who has the thing to say, nor is my worth determined by others. We're just together. You know what I mean? I love that phrase.
So I think that often a given writer is going too far in one direction, or doesn't understand that there is a direction to go in, and needs to hear advice of the form, real writers do such and such, or you should do such and such. I think that my general statement on this would be that the writing advice that's exactly what one writer needs may be exactly the opposite of what another writer needs. And sure. I think that could take us into, if we want to go there,
we go.
Writing advice and common phrases and statements and things that people tell writers.
So let me start with Call a Rabbit a Smurp. I have pulled up the Turkey City Lexicon, which is on the
we got to start
site.
by telling people what it is.
Yes.
So,
you go. Tell them what it is.
So this is not something that creative writers outside of science fiction and fantasy will have any familiarity with. So there's it's a primer for SF workshops. If you Google Turkey City Lexicon SFWA, SFWA, it'll come up. The edited by Lewis Shiner, second edition by Bruce Stirling is the one we're going to be looking at. It is a set of rules, guidelines that was compiled out of many, many years of workshop critiquing. It has a lot of buzzwords, notions, and critical terms of direct use to SF workshops. And it was named after Austin, Texas's writing workshop, the Turkey City Lexicon. So,
I should say I have kind of a love-hate relationship with this document, which is why I wanted to pull it up. The love is that I'm very identified with and happy about and proud of this kind of paraliterary, as Delaney would say, tradition of science fiction workshopping and writing. And this is a parallel tradition that's was for decades not lionized by the Academy, not formally remunerated. Everybody and very much in like solidarity, like all of these independent freelancers banding together to improve each other's work and coming up with this very egalitarian style of doing so is, I think, a beautiful tradition. And
I will say non-genre stuff did this too before it became part of the Academy, right? Like there was a moment, right, where writers were like, well, if we can teach workshops in the Academy, we can have day jobs that will let us eat, right? And so the MFA programs kind of, I would say, evolved out of that. And before that, mainstream writers also did plenty of getting together in workshops, and there are famous ones, and poets certainly have done it all the way along, right? So,
indeed, it goes back to many centuries. I don't know when. I mean, it would be interesting. That'd be an interesting question. Is when I don't know if they were sitting around workshopping in ancient Greece, Sophocles, and well, I mean, you could argue that you could easily see in the context of the Symposium.
Certainly the painters were,
Plato's
and the
Symposium.
Sculptors and so on, right? So
art has generally always been communal, so there certainly has always been. But anyway, this is a particular tradition, and there's these things that come out of it. So the hate part of my love-hate relationship is that a lot of these things get taken as these findings or these crystallized notions, which, as I said, are shorthand, right? Kind of like we were saying about physical theories. Like, it's like, oh, I've noticed this pattern. This often doesn't work, or it does work, or whatever. Get standardized into rules that some people even take as definitional. Your protagonist must protag.
Yeah.
Right? the answer to your protagonist must protag is Mansfield Park, a vast and amazing Jane Austen novel in which the
My least
tremendous
favorite.
moral struggle of the protagonist. She is like a majestic Taoist heroine because her entire moral struggle is that throughout the entire book she must not act. Despite all of the temptations to do so, she must refrain from acting.
And
And that
there's
is
and even
amazing.
in something like Sense and Sensibility, that's
Mm.
you know, a lot of what's going on there with the Emma character. Sorry, not
Eleanor.
Emma. Eleanor character played by
Yeah.
Emma Thompson in my
Yeah,
favorite
yeah.
movie version, but because I adore Emma Thompson beyond all words. But the
her
that
restraint.
I mean, well, and constraints. I would say that
Mhm.
Austen's project overall is often about the constraints on women, the economic constraints on everyone,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And how that limits your ability to act and what you choose to do. It's almost like a sonnet, right? Like what you choose to do within those constraints is what's interesting, like who you are when bound. But yes, protag must
and
protag
that is why I have
yeah.
some energy. That is part of the energy
Yeah.
behind this. Many of these things become these things that we have seen work become watchwords, and then they become ironclad rules, and then they become part of like almost the standardized definition. And there's a political aspect to that because you are always occluding somebody's story when you make some kind of story in the center. And when you say protagonist must protag, you are saying those people who are incapable in this moment of changing their situation, their material situation, because of the constraints, internal or external, imposed upon them, are not the center. They are not protagonists. They're not who we tell stories about.
Great
That's a
point.
profoundly political framing. You
Yeah.
know what
And
I mean?
also it assumes an ability to take action, right? That may not be there for many people, right? So, and I'm thinking actually at Clarion, that particular thing came up because one of my Clarion classmates wrote 6 weeks of beautiful stories that, you know, sometimes they were science fiction, sometimes they were fantasy, but in every story, essentially, you had a protagonist who spent much of the story lying in bed having trouble getting himself to get up and do anything. Right? I mean, and we did not know what to do with these, right? And like in retrospect, we did not serve him well, because we kept trying to get him to like have his protagonist take some action, and like he was engaged, and I don't think he could articulate what he was doing back then either, but he was engaged in a different project. He was so anyway,
there is a book called, and this isn't, I wouldn't set this, I don't want to set this aside, Mansfield Park as a great classic literature, but there's a book that I quite like called, I believe it's called Time's Arrow.
I've heard of that.
It is a book out of the literary world, but I think it reads, it certainly reads well through a genre lens. And it is, I don't want to spoil too much, but the way the book is constructed is very interesting. And the protagonist of the book, who is the narrator, cannot act. Like there is zero. It's an almost science fictional setup, essentially, where the protagonist has zero capability of taking any action ever. I mean, any action, like rubbing the tip of their nose, any action. And nonetheless, what they can do is sort of make assessments about what it is that is happening around them. And the book is actually quite morally gripping because you are at the edge of your seat trying to decide what the protagonist will decide about their world, even though they are absolutely and utterly incapable of action. And that is a great, it's a great counterexample. And I guess that's what I was saying about these rules is like, yes, 9 times out of 10, if you are reviewing somebody's journeyman work, protagonist should protag is a good rule of thumb because they're probably trying to write this sort of story where protagonist should protag. Their audience will probably expect that kind of story, and the reasons their protagonist is not protagging may not be profound. They may just be like a difficulty figure with pacing, right? But if you make that an ironclad rule, you are going to, you're going to end up telling this person in your Clarion class who's struggling to write about depression and what it feels like, your protagonist has to protag, which is the opposite of useful advice for that story.
Yeah, Time's Arrow is Martin Amis, who has written many wonderful books. So I think it's probably well worth a read. I haven't read that particular one, but
I quite liked it.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I've lost the other thing I was going to say. So never mind.
Well,
Back
let me.
to
It
the
may
Turkey
come back.
City. Oh, go ahead.
It may come
Chad.
back to you. Let me.
Yeah.
The reason I want to say another thing, which is the reason that I thought of the Turkey City Lexicon, and that I was like, hey, let's have an episode about writing rules and stuff, is that I am currently doing the line edits for The Unraveling, my first novel.
Yay.
It's come out in 2021.
Yay.
It's come out in German, but my first novel in English. I wrote it in English, and I was having a discussion in the side notes with my brilliant and wonderful editor Liz Gorinsky, who sent me a great number of wonderful line edits. And I think that Liz really wanted these all. She gave me many suggestions, and she was like, "These are all just suggestions. I did it in Word with track changes. You can just accept or reject, right? If you like it, just accept it. If you like my change, if you don't, if you'd rather do it your way, stet is fine. Just reject the change." I, of course, am constitutionally incapable of. I did as much as I could. Like most of them, I just accepted. A certain number of them, I was just like, nah, I don't like her change. I'll reject it. But of course, in many cases, this being me, I had lots to say. And so poor Liz, now I'm trying to send her back this document in such a format where I'm like, okay, look, Liz, you can just, the text is in a state that I would be happy with. So you don't have to read any of these comments. You could literally just accept all changes, and I would have taken the ones I liked, and, it would be okay. But
so instead of publishing the book, would you get more enjoyment out of like a monthly revision of the book for the next 40 years?
No, and by the way, I want to go. It's beyond this. So first of all, you could take what's there, and second of all, I know you don't want to have to do a million round trips. So I have tried to give you a choose your own adventure decision tree in the comments, where it's like, this was your suggestion. I don't like your suggestion, so I'm steading it. But if the motivation for your suggestion was that you had this problem, I have this alternative, which I have pre-approved that you could drop in. Or alternatively, if you were trying to say this, then here's this. So I'm trying to do all the work in advance. So she go through the comments and either just like, if she happens to have time to read the comments, she could be like, all right, I'm going to use Ben's suggestion B. In some cases, I have literally listed like 4 different possible changes for one sentence where I'm like, here are 4 things you might be objecting to, and here are my 4.
Her real reason will be the 5th one that you didn't think of.
Well, then there can be another go round. I'm fine if she wants to send it back.
I think it's fascinating. You're like my instinct for that kind of thing would be, hey editor, can I get half an hour? There's 5 things I want to ask you about.
Well, and that may be the case, but I have to go through the whole thing in order to know what they are anyway.
Yeah.
So I mean, in some case. So anyway, it's easier for me to just
write it out.
I want to go through it anyway. I like most of her changes. I'm accepting most of her changes. But many times I'm like, so in particular, there was this thing about call a rabbit a smirp. So the Turkey City Lexicon says, call a rabbit a smirp, a cheap technique for false exoticism in which common elements of the real world are renamed for a fantastic milieu without any real alteration in their basic nature or behavior. Smirps are especially common in fantasy world where people often ride exotic steeds that look and act just like horses. And the idea is that the rabbit, it's actually a rabbit for all practical intents and purposes, it's clearly a rabbit, but we're calling it a smirp because it's a fantasy world.
So I feel a little called out by this because I find it interesting that you chose this one because I'm pretty sure this has been your main critique of my science fiction.
Oh,
thus
really?
far.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, maybe so. We'll come to that in a moment. But in this case, I was the one called out with this because on the surface of the planet in which the unraveling takes place, all the people live underground. There's 1 trillion people inside the world, as you know, and Bob. And on the outside, there's forest, and the people go up to LARP as Neolithic people and run around with spears trying to hunt lapines. Mm-hmm. And the lapines run around, and if you want, you might, get them with a spear and roast them, and then you'll feel really like Neolithic. So she was like, okay, lapines is not a word in the dictionary. Lapin, like without the E, is like French for rabbit, so I assume these are rabbits. Are you making a joke about call a rabbit a smirp? Because they're literally rabbits. And you're not calling them that. And I was like, it's less a joke about call a rabbit a smirp than it is a defiant rejection of the rule about calling a rabbit a smirp. Because here's the thing. I want the reader to know that these are basically rabbits. Mm-hmm. That's why I'm using the word lapine, which sounds a lot. I mean, it's pretty clearly a rabbit. Also, it's a furry thing that runs around and you can hit it with a spear and then roast it. It's clearly a rabbit. And there's nothing that these things do in the book that is in any way different from rabbits. They could literally just be rabbits. But this book is set 500,000 years in the future. What is the likelihood that they're rabbits? Like, particularly because this is a thing where that's, it's this deep future, slower than light travel, vast cultural variance. Also, there's this sort of backstory that's not even really in the book about like how hard singularities happen and then crash and stuff. I'm like, these things have a genome which is mostly from the genus of rabbits, but like there were a lot of pieces missing that they had to fill in with DNA from cockroaches and moss, and like none of this is in the book. I'm just making this up, but like, you know what I mean? It's like, and to get the behavior right, all they had was an old copy of the animated film Watership Down. That's like the only, no one had ever seen a rabbit for 10,000 years, but there was this one hard drive that had survived that had Watership Down on it. So based on that and some DNA samples, they made these things and they look like rabbits. But my whole point is, they're obviously not rabbits.
Mm-hmm.
That makes me think of A Fire Upon the Deep, where there's a large part of the book that appears to be set in a ridiculously human, setting, even though they're aliens. And I'm going, why do these aliens have a town called Princeton? Like, that's just ridiculous. And it eventually turns out that there's much more going on than is evident.
Essentially that you're reading a translation, that it's like through a filter of translation. Yeah.
I mean, I do think where that rule generally comes from.
Okay.
I think it's a good guideline as a starting point, right? And that's true of many of these Tricky City rules, I think, right? Because when I write science fiction, I'm most engaged in the interactions between people. I want it to be on another planet because I'm using that science fictional, cognitive estrangement to try and get people away from their preconceptions. Then I'm like, well, it's another planet. They probably wouldn't have rabbits, right? So there's going to be whatever the local fauna are, right? It's not as complicated as you were set up. It's just the local fauna on my planet of Kriti that is in the Stars Change and in the forthcoming Jump Space book. I have these deer-like creatures, right? Mm-hmm. And when you're first introduced to them, they're deer-like, right? And I could stop. I guess I feel like. I think that's fine. I could just call them deer, like the native, the locals came from Earth, they saw these things, and they decided, like, we could come up with a new name for them, but they're basically deer. We're going to call them deer. And I think that's okay. You have to kind of, make that feel real in the world of the book.
I forget what I read recently. There was a great book where you think that they're deer or whatever, and then at some point it's just mentioned offhand that they have tentacles. And you're like, holy crap, these aren't deer. Like, and you realize exactly that's what's happened, is that this is people using Earth terms because they're familiar, but clearly this is not what we think.
Not exactly the same. I think that's very funny, right? Like when you do that kind of thing. And I kind of think my deer creatures are going to be somewhat empathic or telepathic or something. So they're not really Earth deer. But I could also come up with another name for them, which is, I think, what I ended up deciding to do. I can't quite remember. And then I think where it goes well is that hopefully that leads you towards thinking through their alienness a little bit in interesting ways, right? Like that's where, that's kind of what the rule is pointing at. Don't just call a rabbit a smearp. Now you got to think about what smearps are, right? In a useful and interesting way.
I think the underlyingly useful rule here is like engage with your world, right? Like, so in a sense, it's like, why are you calling the rabbit a smearp? All right. I mean, and what about them is different? And the reason that the lapine is a funny example is it literally is a rabbit for all intents and purposes of the book. Like I abstain from doing anything that would make it not a rabbit. There's no moment when you realize it has tentacles. But like, I'm very clear that like I intentionally want to signal something about the kind of deep future history this is by not having it be a rabbit,
I think that I wrote a blog entry about some of this stuff back in 2004 titled Fictional Translation and got some interesting responses. I think that one of the things that I got out of that was that different people are going to have different kinds of responses. Some of different readers, I mean. To some degree, this is a genre convention that you just, you have, if you have a fantasy world, then you're going to have kerflugal trees and they might or might not look like any trees that we've normally seen on Earth. But I think that different readers are going to react differently to different aspects of that. One of the examples that came up during that discussion was the word peach, where some people said, you can't have something peach. Apparently, the word peach apparently comes from something to do with Persia, and they said you can't have peaches if you don't in a world that doesn't have Persia. And then other people pointed to an example in Robert Jordan where there are things that are called peaches, but they're actually poisonous or something. And then there was some discussion of how that might actually be. Anyway, my point being just
and also that etymology thing is like, that goes all the way down. Like there's a lot of words you can't have if you know what I mean? Then
yes, if you start thinking too much about the words in the etymology, it gets to be a real
If you're
mess.
writing in German, you can't have emperors anymore since the word is literally Caesar.
This is where I have to put in, I have this XKCD comic on my wall, on my office door for my students, and it's XKCD 483, if you want to look it up. And it's just a little graph, the axis going up, probability book is good, axis along the bottom, number of words made up by author. And there's essentially saying like the more words that the author makes up, the less likely it is that the book is good. And he gives an example. The elders or frost guarded the farmlings' children with their critoses, which are like swords, but awesomer, which is pretty hilarious. And I will admit that like when I get I get stories from my students and I open up the file and for me, it's the capital letter rule. If on the first page, there's like 20 words with capital letters in the middle of sentences, that's generally not a great sign, right?
Except when it is.
Yes.
But generally, did I not say generally?
You said
Ben?
generally.
Oh
you
my
said
gosh.
Generally. No, I'm not.
I know, but you have this reflexive reaction
I
to
do.
like, oh my God, Marianne gave me a rule. I will fight back against it. I already put the framing in there of generally. So
I wasn't
don't tell me what to
accusing you.
Do, Mom.
I wasn't accusing you of having not said generally. I was completing your sentence.
So yes. So it's something to watch out for. It's something to kind of like, and where they say in Turkey City that it's cheap, I would almost say lazy is really what it is, or maybe lazy is too judgmental, but unconsidered, right?
Here's the thing though. What I want to do with these rules is look beneath them, right? So I think that what we're talking about here is an area like that. I think the XKCD thing is funny, but you'll notice that in the title text, he's like, "Well, not Lewis Carroll or Tolkien," which is kind of revealing. Does he get to throw that title text in? Like, because do you get to have a footnote saying not? I'm cherry picking out these people who I like, who like apparently also not Russell Hoban or Shakespeare or. Anthony Burgess or anybody who we like because they make up words, which is a whole subgenre, really. Like, so the question is,
but I mean, like, I think they'd say like some people do it well, and many
people.
I
feel like that, and I feel like this is a unifying theme with a lot of the Turkey City things. Where a lot of my problem when I say it's a love-hate relationship, a lot of my problem is that very often Turkey City says X is bad. When I think they want to say X is hard. When you make up words, you are being a poet. Like you are leaving the realm of prose. You are now crafting language, and you're in the ball pit with Shakespeare and Tolkien and Russell Hoban. You got to be able to play at that level. You got to bring your game. Like it's actually far from discouraging people. What we should be saying is this is one of the most. This is like the boss. This is like, what do you call it? The level boss, right? Like you are facing the Balrog here because it's hard.
Speaking of,
but that doesn't mean don't do it. Like I don't want us to lose the next Russell Hoban or Shakespeare because we discourage them at Clarion from trying this, because it is what you are doing is you are getting under the hood to the dark heart of language. And I think about this a lot when I make up words, because I do make up words, and I think it's hard to make. You cannot pick a random set of phonemes. Like what really matters is what are you evoking on an unconscious level with this set of letters. You know what I mean? It's like names. I mean, it's the same thing as picking names. It is so, if you change one letter in a name, you could break a book, because there is an entire poetics that lies under the denotative meaning of everything. You know?
Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I just listened to a Milk Street podcast where they were talking to someone who studied the linguistics of how you name things in food and what people respond to. And like, there is a reason why Cheetos and crackers and so like all like Cheez-Its all have that kind of sound in there. And there's a different reason why Rocky Road and all of these ice creams have different vowels in them because they raise different connotations in the listener's brain. And I was like, I did not think about this when I was coming up with a new ice cream flavor, and maybe I should, or if I want to market it successfully, right?
So I think that is useful to know, but I also think that it's worth noting that it does vary by reader, it does vary by culture. And that different readers are going to have different reactions to made up words. That there was a story that we published at Strange Horizons where the first several paragraphs included a bunch of made up words, and there was a certain subset of readers who said, this is terrible. There were a bunch of made up words and I didn't like it and I stopped reading. Obviously, we editors thought that it was done very well. But I also think that there is a real world effect in this, which is that that it depends on who you think your audience is. If you think that your audience is, upper middle class, white and English speaking Americans, and you therefore leave out the words or put in the words that come from other languages that those readers are not going to recognize, that those readers are going to think of as made up or hard words, then that also has an effect on your work and on its audience.
Yeah, we talked about that. The linguists were interesting. Yeah, Judd wasn't there for that episode. That did come up in our last interview with Cadwell Turnbull. It was interesting because the linguists were not being very culturally relativist about it. They were kind of firm on like this is like human nature, and like if you called Cheez-Its Chorits or something like that, people would buy less of them across the world. So I know I'm not advocating for this.
I think there's some there and some not there. Like there's some. I mean, but that's the kind of thing linguists like to argue about. But there may. I mean, I'm not averse to the notion that there's some fundamental. Like I believe, for instance, that there are 4 built-in hardwired prosodies, like that across cultures you can tell if someone is consoling a baby or consoling or scolding a child without knowing the language. Like I think that's neural mapping. Not that you could change your brain too, but a lot of things are not, right? And a lot of times this is an interaction between. But anyway, the point is also the point is also that yes, of course everyone's going to have a different reaction to it, but again, that is not like you are deciding to be a poet when you make up words. And when you decide to be a poet, of course everyone's going to have drastically different reactions to your work, and like in a way that's much harder to articulate on some level for this kind of thing than like, oh, well, it didn't check the spot. No, but I mean, that it doesn't mean that there's not, it's like abstract art. It's like with realistic art, you could be like, does it look like a nose? If you're looking at like Max Ernst, it's hard to have a vocabulary to be other than like, I don't like it. But like, in fact, that doesn't mean that anybody can be Max Ernst, right? Like Max Ernst is a genius, even though it's all blobs, because they're the right blobs. You know what I mean?
I think what happens, right, is that when a new writer is starting out with this, there was something that they loved about, say, Tolkien, right?
Yeah.
And they're reaching for that, right? And then in the reaching, they're like, well, Tolkien had Ents, so I'm going to make up a word for my creatures the same way he does. But that making up the word is not sufficient to get you to the full reality of Ents, right?
Because Tolkien was a linguist and made up entire languages that work, right?
Well, but it's not even just the linguist part. It's just that like he actually paints you a portrait of the culture and the history and the character of Ents as a whole, and the particular Ent you meet, and his tensions with the rest of the Ents when they're going into this argument, and the cultural strictures that are going to make this difficult. I mean, like, all of that is what actually makes you love, and the fact that the Ent wives are lost, that's the bit that breaks your heart, right? And so, and like, they're still in mourning, and they're still longing for them, and all of that together is what made that young writer fall in love with the Ents and want to do this kind of thing again, right? And so then they have to do that work, rather than just
and I think
that
the danger of these rules is it's like a lot of these are like guarded posts of like, oh, your first story and you're trying to make up words like Tolkien, that's not going to work, which is like, on the one hand, the thing about this is that I think the message is A, it's hard, and B, it's not central. Like, it's not something that we all agree a story has to have. We're all going to sit around and talk in critique group about how your protagonist has to protag and how I want to like the characters and how I want to care about what's happening and raise the stakes and all that stuff. But we don't all want you to make up words, right? Like some of us don't even want to play that game. And so like it's not like but what I want to say to this writer who sent you a manuscript full of capital letters is like, you are embarking upon a great and perilous journey. There are all kinds of things you don't know, but it's nonetheless, it is a worthy task if that's what you're called to do in your art, right? Like,
yeah, yes.
So
And,
yes,
and I feel like you get a.
Go
Sorry, I'll
ahead.
just say one other thing, right? So one of the problems with genre, one of the great things about genre, whatever, is that these tropes are so powerful that, when I go into an airport bookstore and I'm trying to buy a book, if it has a dragon on the cover, I will grab it because I know that it is likely to satisfy something I'm looking for. Or if you're a romance reader and they've got the two intertwined people on the cover, similarly, it's likely to satisfy that. And so I think with my student writers, what I'll often see is they're looking for that hit of this thing that they love. They want to provide it. They do provide it, but in a fairly shallow form, right? So they're getting the reader satisfaction. Their readers are getting that satisfaction, but it ends up being something that you consume and forget. And usually in the writing class, we're trying to move them beyond that, right? So I don't know.
yeah, I don't know. On the other hand, I'm also skeptical of this is the like, and I think we should move on because we've got a lot of other terms. But I will say,
I almost feel like we could do a term an episode rather than try
maybe.
and hit all of them, right?
Well, no, I wasn't gonna hit all, but I was gonna go show and tell you next because I feel like that's
Okay.
the other big one we want to talk about. And maybe some others too. But what I was gonna say about forgettable is, I think that's no doubt very true. But it's also interesting that, and I think we've touched on this before. It's also interesting that like there is like all the craft you need to aggregate to have the like full nuanced effect that you want, and then there's also like but I think that's often that sort of mastery is often, I often hear that soundbite, the like, well, you want it to last forever, you want it not to be forgettable and consumable. But what's interesting is like, I don't know, I feel like a lot of the things that stay with me from like sometimes an image stays with you from something that was frankly terrible in terms of craft and mastery.
I would say it may be terrible in many ways, but there was something about that image that was not terrible. And I will, it's hard to do everything right at once. I'll give a visual example of what I'm talking about. So right now, I've recently started doing surface pattern design. I drew a dragon recently, and I'm probably going to try to do something like a dragon for the next design challenge. And so when I try and draw a dragon as a beginner, I'm really happy if the end result looks like a dragon. Like that's all I'm shooting for. I'm like, is it recognizably a dragon? Like, when I took a drawing class, after 6 weeks, I could do a charcoal apple that people could tell was an apple, and I was thrilled, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Jen Reese is a writer and artist friend of ours, and she's doing a year of dragons right now, where every day she draws a different dragon, posts it to social media. And you can see the mastery in her work because each of those dragons, maybe I haven't seen all of them, but everyone I've seen has had personality, has had some little bit of zing to it that is interesting beyond the fact that this is recognizably a dragon. And that's what I'm like, I hope to eventually get to that stage with art. And that's kind of what I'm talking about with the writing here. Right?
Yeah.
I think we're in agreement. So
I mean, it's not that I don't like mastery. I like mastery. I just think it's interesting that I just think mastery can be very choppy. As you say, if I'm reading some god-awful piece of something that's like terrible, but on the other hand has some resonant image that will stay with me forever. Like, in fact, a lot of that golden age of science fiction 12 is like that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of books that don't hold up when you go back. Like, I don't know that Ringworld holds up that well if you go back. But God,
I don't think I can bear to reread it.
But don't.
Yeah.
But the image of a Ringworld, like the things that work about that book, and him plugging himself into the wall with he's like an addict on the neural. Like there's these and the Xin and the puppeteers. I mean, there's so much brilliance in that.
Yeah.
But actually, if you read the book, like a lot of it is not very, you know what I mean? But that's what I mean
Yeah.
about mastery being like I would take that sort of set of world building ideas any day of the week. You know what I mean? Even if when I go back to the prose, I'm like, ooh, and social politics.
I
And
find
it's
Niven
anyway,
kind of
whatever.
comforting to read these days. I'm finding just because it's so much nostalgia for me. Like I
Yeah,
spent my childhood reading Niven.
I mean, and I don't want to down. I don't actually want, like, when I read it now, it doesn't hold up for me as a 50-year-old.
Yeah.
But I don't want to be so arrogant as to privilege my 50-year-olds reading from my 12-year-olds reading. Like, I think in some way that it was I was as completely just as valid and equipped a reader at 12. I just had different tastes. But I do not have any interest in
but you have been
patronizing my younger self.
Sure, but you
know what I
have been
mean?
exposed to a lot more, right?
But
I mean,
that's also a loss. I mean, yes, I've been exposed to a lot more and some things have deepened, but I have also lost some ability to, my head is crowded with all kinds of things. I do not have as much room to completely throw myself into an idea that is new to me with that kind of vibrant, unabashed love that I did. And that is, I could use some of that.
And it may be harder to get sense of wonder. Go ahead.
There's two things I want to reference here. So one of them is maybe 2 years ago, I went back and reread Handmaid's Tale. And what was fascinating to me is that I had remembered all of the ideas of the book and the overall plot, and that was enough for me to love it. Like I would push it on people based purely on the ideas and the plot. When I went back to reread it, I was like, oh my God, this is really well written. Like it is a pleasure sentence
Sometimes
to
it's
sentence.
a pleasant surprise.
Like on the page, I was like, I had forgotten because when I read it first, I was maybe 20 and I'm sure that had factored into my enjoyment of the reading, but I didn't remember that it was well written. And when I went back, I was like, whoa, that's very impressive that it has all of this happening at once. So anyway,
there's another way. And there's another way, in addition to the fact that my younger self had this more, was closer to wonder, had more capacity to throw his heart into something completely. There's also a thing where things annoy me now and break my reader enjoyment because of the amount of irritation I have amassed over the year. It's not that the 12-year-old me maybe didn't notice, like, that's not, maybe the 12-year-old me was just as aware, like, that's not really true. People don't really act like that, or one wouldn't really say that. But it maybe didn't spoil 12-year-old me's enjoyment as much because I didn't have, like, the resentment and irritation of having people write in a tropey way. You know what I mean? And like, I was just more forgiving, not in an ignorant way, just in a, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's a related, different two things, but I find movies and TV shows kind of difficult to watch these days in the sense that I have to turn off my writer brain, or most of the time I know exactly what's going to happen. Like it's just, it's super clear what they're setting up. And like, I've been watching, we've been watching The Librarians with the kids, and it's a delightful, silly romp. It's very predictable. And that's, and so that is a little bit of a loss. It's not predictable to my kids yet. Like it's predictable to me.
You're watching She-Ra, right?
I watched all of She-Ra, yes.
I mean, that what? Oh yeah, awesome. That is one of the pleasures of that show, was like watching a like zany kids show and like literally not having to turn my writer brain off. Particularly the finale, I was like, how are all these moving pieces?
No spoilers.
I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to spoil anything, except for the fact that the mastery of craft. That I was like, there's so many balls in the air.
Yeah.
How could this work?
It was really well done. Yeah, anyway. It did. Yes.
Let's talk about Show Don't Tell.
Well, hang on. But I did want to bring up something that happened yesterday. At the end of the semester, I asked my students if they wanted to get together to play Among Us as a kind of close off the semester thing. So we did. Not all of them, but some of them showed up, and my kids played with us. And as we were playing this online computer game where you run around a spaceship, and one of you is, well, for people who don't know,
the social deduction game on a spaceship.
One of you is the imposter, and the others are trying to figure out who's the imposter, and the imposter is killing people off. You are very generic animated images, right? There's like a little blue person and a little pink person, a little green person. And we were chatting, and at one point, my son says to my daughter something about like, well, you've shipped these two characters. And I was like, wait, what? There's like fic about Among Us. And then one of my students
about
was like,
the blue
there's
blob
fic
and the red
about
blob.
everything.
It's a Rule 34A.
Right. And then I was like, but like, they're not even characters. Like, there's not, like, how do you ship two of these little figures running under screen? And then the student was like, well, people have evolved personalities. So cyan has a certain personality, and pink has a certain personality, and green, and like, and
That's
then
amazing.
people are shipping them. And so I was just like, so just in terms of like, you can have a very generic sketch of a shape, and then people put all the peopleness in.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
And that's also such a wonderful story about the way that commercial media and fan media interacts. And fan media is often really folk media. I mean, that's really like folkloric. That's really a folkloric process to have these. It's sort of like how, there would be these, it's sort of like, I'm thinking of sort of like barely Christianized Northern European tribes would like come up with their whole, like, what's Santa Claus about? Like, that just all, just fill in the backstory of these sort of vague images they've been presented with. Anyway, drawing from other, cultural traditions and things.
Jed, did you want to? Yeah.
Show don't tell.
Before we get to show don't tell.
Okay, before.
I know. But I want to say this about the Turkey City Lexicon in general, which is that there are a few issues with it as a list. One of them is what you've been saying about ossifying into rules and all of the various issues along those lines. One is that there are a fair number of the kinds of stories that it lists that I've never encountered. And so I don't feel a need to argue against them. And another is that even for the ones that I have seen, I find these names for them confusing and annoying. Call a rabbit a smurp, said bookism. Anytime that you want to tell somebody that they're using a said bookism, you're going to have to define what a said bookism is. I actually kind of feel that same way about TV trope names, where the trope name just isn't something that I'm going to recognize at first. And that makes me think that one thing that's nice about TV tropes is that it is descriptive rather than prescriptive. It's saying, here's a bunch of tropes and ways that people do things, and we're going to list them, and we're going to connect them to each other, but we're not going to say, this one is bad, never do it.
Yeah, I love that about TV tropes, sure. Yeah, and I think that there is a way in which Turkey City Lexicon is dated, and like any collection of patterns, it's like, well, it's useful shorthand if you know the shorthand.
Yes.
And lots of these are no longer in currency, but many of them are, and I think they're still worth talking about. Also, one of the things that I thought goes along with what you're saying is that a lot of these, which I think were considered bad or considered harmful in the Dijkstra sense, that's a programmer joke, are now like respectable genres. I mean, literally, there's something called the slipstream story.
Yeah.
Which, for a while there, a decade ago, slipstream was a big, hot new subgenre. But, at the time of the composition of the Turkey Lexicon, it was considered a failure mode. I mean, there's a lot of tabloid weird. I want to read that. I mean, it's definitely a collection of tropes. But certainly there are some things that have stayed in the lexicon and that are used as, that still are felt like that still are presented as ironclad rules,
such as show don't tell. And
that's
another example of something that has a name that always has to be explained. It took me many years to understand what the point of show don't tell was, because the phrase didn't make any sense to me.
Interesting. Go on.
Well, go ahead and define it for people.
But tell us about show don't tell.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read what the Turkey City Lexicon says first?
Yeah,
sure. Start with that. Yes.
Show don't tell, a cardinal principle of effective writing. That's not positioning it as a rule or anything. A cardinal principle of effective writing. The reader should be allowed to react naturally to the evidence presented in the story, not instructed in how to react by the author. Specific incidents and carefully observed details will render auctorial lectures unnecessary. For instance, instead of telling the reader she had a bad childhood, an unhappy childhood, a specific incident involving, say, a locked closet and 2 jars of honey should be shown. Rigid adherence to show don't tell can become absurd. Minor matters are sometimes best gotten out of the way in a swift, straightforward fashion. It does have that caveat, although that's not my only problem with it. Go on, Jed.
Go ahead, Jed.
Go ahead. It sounds like you both have.
Well, it's interesting. Like the way I do teach this to my students now. I mean, first of all, I sort of bring it up to dismiss it. But then I reframe it because I would say that you're talking about essentially the difference between dramatizing something and summarizing it. And I particularly like the way Le Guin talks about it in her book, Staring the Craft. She calls it crowding and leaping. So there's a great chapter in there where she, I recommend this book to everyone. It's very short. The chapters are like 3 paragraphs plus some examples and exercises. But, if you were trying to represent life on the page, it would take so long that it would be life, right? Like it wouldn't be a story anymore, right? You can't actually reproduce with complete fidelity what your actual life is. So by necessity, we have to sometimes leap over sections and summarize them, and say she had a terrible childhood, whatever it is, right? But the question, and I would say, I guess I talk about this a lot with my students because it's something I struggle with. I am a sort of lazy writer, and my impulse is to summarize a lot. And so if I'm not paying close attention to this, what will happen is I will bring something to workshop, and my critiquers will sort of say, like we're not engaging with this because you've kind of skimmed over all of the interesting stuff, right? There's too much summary. And I end up having to go back in and figure out which bits to dramatize. And that selection process is an interesting and challenging one. In The Stars Change, when I gave that book to Cecilia at Circlet, Cecilia Tan, to publish, one of the main edits she made was she came back to me and she was like, you have this big climactic decision scene where they're trying to decide whether to put themselves at risk to save the aliens, and you skip over it. You like dispense of it in a summary, and it's the heart of the book. Why did you not dramatize this? And essentially the answer was, well, it's a big like meal with a lot of people, and it's going to be hard to write. Because literally that was the reason, right? Like it was going to be hard to write. I was going to have to like manage all of the different names and who's talking and like the social dynamics and all of that complexity. And also it was the emotional heart of the book. And so there was like some relationship tension stuff that I was kind of shying away from between the mom and the daughter and whatever that I needed to push myself to put on the page. Right. And I'll give one more anecdote and then let you talk. When I gave my novel to my agent, the first draft of my novel, he came back with various comments about why it wasn't working. But one of the big ones was he's like, I don't understand why you skip over all of these things that any commercial writer would dramatize, right? And so I kind of want to highlight that, he is a commercial science fiction fantasy agent for the most part. He represents some big epics and whatever else. And so he's not saying like I write badly, but the way I was approaching it was often in a minimal, restrained, like really pulled back kind of way, rather than putting things into scene. So scene and summary is another way to talk about this, right? So okay, there's a whole bunch of stuff.
So,
and so
I want to build on that because I think there's really 3 things. So I think the main, and I think they are intertwined, and I think that you are talking about more than one of them, but the when you frame it as leaping, I love that framing, crowding and leaping, but that is one aspect of show don't tell has to do with, so there's pacing is one aspect, another aspect is distance, and another aspect is voice. So part of it, like you say, is that you have to choose what's important, and then that naturally means that the time dilation is happening, that you're rushing into paragraph. You can go through a year in a paragraph if you want to jump ahead, and then you can linger for 20 pages on a minute, because you're talking about what, because you're making choices about what to call the reader's attention to and what to engage with, right? So that's their telling is summarizing. So that's one kind of telling, is the summarizing kind of telling, which is we're not going to plod through talking about the guy walking to work and every bit of the sidewalk, because that's not important. So we just say he went to work. Or, we're going to, that there's a campaign. Sometimes there's an entire, war between, they go to war, and then there's one page where they're at war, and then it's the aftermath is the rest of the book, because we only care one page, about the siege of such and such, and then we're done.
Yeah. And what you care about is genre dependent, right? So, and I say that because I'm thinking about sex scenes in particular. And I remember Jennifer Stevenson and I were on a panel at one point, and she was talking about how in romance you might have 20 pages on a meal, where the two people are just having a meal, but it's because that meal is all subliminal sex, and that subliminal sex is informing you about their relationship and what stage it's at, or 20 pages of an actual sex scene doing the same thing. And I thought that was really interesting, because you don't typically see that in science fiction, right? So
neither the meal nor the sex. I mean, and I think that is... yes, exactly. Part of what distinguishes genres is which pieces of the world they're interested in investigating. Like how much time are we spending on meals? How much time are we spending on violence? How much time are we spending on figuring things out, or, encountering the new? Those are sort of markers, and they're related to sources of reader pleasure. So one thing is pacing and like where we turn the camera and what we're interested in. But there's another thing, a couple of other things. One of them is distance. So like, because when we talk about leaping and crowding, you are saying, well, the assumption there is like, well, the important part of the story is what we dramatize, and then what we summarize are the parts that we just need to get through. But of course, one of my favorite works of fiction, Calvino's Invisible Cities, is essentially all telling. There is no scene. There is no summary. It is all summarized, which sort of breaks the idea that, the interesting parts of the scenes. No, the interesting part is the telling. And it's because that is a mode which is on purpose very distanced and very told. And so I think the rule is less. So a lot of times fairy tale modes, various kinds of modes, are intentionally distanced and are intentionally telling and abstracting and summarizing. And those can have very powerful emotional effects, they're not because of the immediate vividness of you being right up against the surface of the experience. You are looking at it at some kind of remove, and that is what the telling is doing. So I think the next level of rule under show don't tell, like if you want to move past show don't tell, like 2.0 version of that, it's really showing intensifies telling distances. And the reason you tell beginning writers show don't tell is they usually have more trouble writing things that are vivid and intense than they do writing things that are spare and distanced. Like you want to get them to like be able to get the reader involved and gripped and their heart racing. But that doesn't mean that that's the only, you need an accelerator and a brake. And it's actually important to be able to distance, and you can create all kinds of powerful effects by distancing. So I have a subsidiary rule to that. Go, Jed, you want to say something?
Finish your subsidiary rule, and then I'll jump in.
So my subsidiary rule is that, so in some way, there's certain ways in which I'm kind of a show don't tell zealot in certain regards. And one thing is that I have kind of a little internal, and I don't 100% do this, but I almost feel like, and this also came up the Light Edit, because I think there were some changes I was reverting or putting back. And I noticed my own peculiar little finicky things that I do because someone else is editing the text and making suggestions, and I'm like, I would never do that. I'm changing it to my way. So one of the things that's like my persnickety thing is, I think that if you say Jane was happy, the reader definitely does not feel happy. Like if you name an emotion, you are banishing that emotion from the reader's experience in that moment. That is a thing that I have observed, which doesn't mean you should never do it. But if you want the reader to be right there with Jane, deep into Jane's experience, feeling the happiness, you have to let the happiness happen. You have to let the observation of happiness, the synthesis of happiness happen in the reader's brain. All the things that are making Jane happy have to be salient for the reader, so that the reader's experience echoes Jane. As soon as you say Jane was happy, you kind of whoosh, Jane is now on the page. You've sort of created this remove where we are observing Jane. She is over there being happy. We are over here knowing as a fact that she is happy. I'm not saying this 100%, but that is generally my experience.
I want to talk about this in the context of YA, but Jed, go first.
Well, so that was actually a good connection to what I wanted to say, which is that most of the time when I hear show don't tell, it is much less in the context of summarizing versus dramatizing, and much more in the context of she was sad versus tears streamed down her face. And I think that there is, I recognize the value in what you're talking about, but I also think that there is a certain privileging of neurotypicality in that we are supposing, when you say that kind of show don't tell, we are supposing that the reader will be able to figure out, will be able to do that translation, and will be able to say, okay, tears indicate that she's sad. And that one isn't so hard, but I have seen a lot of contexts, both in visual media and in writing, where the author describes, portrays the actor portrays the emotion, and we're supposed to be able, as an audience, to know what that emotion is and empathize with it. And sometimes I just don't, and I don't think that I'm particularly on the spectrum, but there are certain contexts in which I don't recognize those cues as meaning what they are intended to mean, and perhaps what most people would get them to mean. But I think that part of this also ties in. I want to throw in a bit from. So there was an author named Tom Ramey. I think it's pronounced Ramey. I'm not sure. Reamy. In the introduction to one of his books, Harlan Ellison wrote that Ramey was a real writer, and that the way that you knew that was that he could see two people walking down the street and know immediately what their story was. And my reaction to that is, I see two people walking down the street interacting. I can come up with a dozen different possibilities for what their story might be.
Exactly.
And I feel like I have that same reaction a lot of the time to attempts to show rather than tell emotion. That I could think of three different underlying emotions that might be going on that might cause them to act in this way, and I'm not sure which one the author means.
Yeah, but I just want to weigh in on that. And I mean, it's very interesting, the point you raise, and I definitely have seen that with. So I mean, my son's autistic, and he and we consume a lot of media together, and it has been very interesting watching him partly like logically bootstrap his way into being able to have a great sophistication now at reading social cues and stuff, but definitely he arrived at by a very conscious process, and I mean, you've met one autistic person, so I don't want to, obviously one cannot generalize from his experience at all. But when I am thinking about him in the context of what you're saying, I still would say, I don't know that the cues would be the same. Like what I've noticed about Noah, there's this sort of, one of the pieces of hate speech directed at autistic people is that they don't have empathy, which is nonsense, right? Yeah. Noah's hugely empathetic. But the point is, you can't empathize with something if you don't know it's happening.
Yeah.
So like if you're not able to observe that something is happening, you could hardly. So what strikes me is that what you're talking about is if the reader says, "Oh, her eyes widened and she took a step back," and what, like those are all the cues you get.
Right.
Like that is not certain readers, you are not actually giving them the information.
Yeah.
But I nonetheless sort of stand by my point that if you tell those readers she was shocked, they will now know as an intellectual matter that she was shocked. But that doesn't, which is helpful to them for parsing the text.
Yeah.
But that still doesn't conjure the emotion of being shocked. If, on the other hand, something that Noah was always quite good at is logically not like, well, like her planet was destroyed, or like she did not have it. You know what I mean? Like I'm not saying you've got to do it all in like the kind of gestural, but like if I have all the facts and I'm in her experience, then the point I'm talking about is not tears streamed down her face. It's not like, oh, use gestural language rather than information. Because I agree that has this aspect. What I'm saying is the reader's identification with the character's experience has to do with the reader's own act of synthesis of information. That is lots of different kinds of information, but the information is information that you have arrived at because your brain is synthesizing it from the facts available, is available to you emotionally in a way that information that is simply has been pre-synthesized by someone else and given to you is not.
Interesting.
But again, so I think that is something that, of course, that's going to be very different depending on how you synthesize, how you perceive information,
right.
What kinds of information are accessible to you. But still, I think that would also be true, even when Noah was a little kid and his experience was very different. I think that certainly would be true, that things that he synthesized himself, he had an ownership of, a connection to, a closeness to, that was different if somebody just informs you of something. But Jane was sad is sometimes a really good thing to write. It's not. I'm not saying don't ever use emotion words, but you don't use them when you want the reader to be like feeling the feeling. Right. But on the other hand, sometimes it's really powerful to distance the reader from what's happening.
So I want to give.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to give just four examples of things that I think are interesting in the context of what you're saying. One of them is Martha Wells' incredibly popular Murderbot series, and in which you have a non-neurotypical protagonist, and the way in which Murderbot is very distanced from their own emotional experience and how Wells represents that on the page is fascinating, because she does not tell you Murderbot was sad or Murderbot was traumatized, or she says Murderbot goes and watches more TV. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so anyway, I would recommend it.
Crying because,
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a great example where distancing can be heartbreaking, because precisely when you have because you feel the distance that the character has from their own.
I mean, it's like, I would say my experience of reading those stories is like, initially there was sort of puzzling aspect of like, wait, what's going on with this character? And then it got more and more emotionally intense, right? And like, even though Wells does not change the way she depicts that emotion, but once I understand what's going on, it breaks your heart.
You sort of pick up the reading protocols. It teaches you how to, nice.
Yeah, and then, three more examples.
Okay.
One,
I have to say that I do your examples, and then I think I have to. I'm actually late.
You got to
go.
I have to wrap.
But go
quickly,
through your thing.
I would say that if you're interested in this question of like how you can evoke emotion, Edgar Allan Poe was super interested in how you use language to do that, and he not only does he do it in his stories and in his poetry in The Raven and Cask of Amontillado, etc., but he's written critical work on it. So any grad students listening to this, go take a look at Poe on how you evoke emotion in language. I think it's interesting. I would say in the YA front, one of the things I've struggled with is that I want to push like my childhood YA on my kids. It's too distant for them. When they read A Wrinkle in Time, they don't engage. My daughter does not engage with a lot of the emotion that's super clear to me, I think is not clear to her.
That's fascinating.
And current YA conventions are to emote a lot more. So like when I give an agent or an editor a draft of my YA novel where the prose is very similar to Wrinkle in Time prose, they give it back to me with like, you need a lot more emotion on the page, which I think is fascinating. And the last thing I was going to end with is Jed and I are in some disagreement about how Sonequa Martin Green is portraying the protagonist on Discovery, because for me, she over emotes in a way that is so dramatic that it throws me out. It breaks the story for me. And I notice her acting. More, and it makes me want to laugh almost. And I feel like that is potentially like a cultural aspect to the emotion, in the sense that like I grew up as a New Englander and you don't do this kind of thing, right? Like,
that's
it's
funny.
like,
also, that changed a lot over time. There was, of course, a big shift between sort of 19th century extremely dramatic and stylized acting, and then like naturalized, starting in, also in the beginning of the 20th century, and like, increasingly sort of naturalized, subtle acting, partly driven by movies. And
what I think is jarring about this is in part that it's not consistent. Like I can watch a Bollywood film and everyone is emoting that way, and I'm fine with it. But here, all the other actors are playing in a more restrained manner, and her lip is trembling and so on, right? And
I recognize that people are feeling that way, but it baffles me because I don't see it at all. I think I love what she's doing, and I find her incredibly
interesting.
I empathize a lot.
I think for me, it makes it less emotional because she's putting so much on the screen, right?
And that is something I think, just to wrap up, I gotta go, but that is something I think in fiction too, that there is, again, different readers are going to be different, and there's this definitely, I feel like there's a slider of how much emotion some people are going to find something cold, distant and antiseptic and not engaging, and then moving that slider in the other direction, there's another group of readers who are very quickly going to find it melodramatic or sentimental or sappy or over the top, and like how much emotion, overt emotion you're comfortable with, and I think that's not one-to-one with the thing I was talking about with naming emotion, but it's there's definitely that variance in reader sensitivity and trying to like get the line of how much overt emotion. And the other thing about telling, last thing I'll say, is that telling is always in a voice. So there's a way in which the distinction is actually, to some extent, this distinction is, in some ways, you are always showing. Because if your narrator says, over the next 3 months she built a castle, like, sure, that's summarizing, but that's a narrator who in that moment is deciding to tell you that and finds those things salient, and like, that's another thing that's happening. So I mean, while it's it's like particles and waves, right? Like, it's a useful distinction, showing and telling, but on some level of close observation, the distinction breaks down, right? Because
well, and it'd be interesting to talk about close limited third. Can be very close to first person in that sense, or you can go towards a much more detached omniscient, right? Or the camera eye or whatever else.
And another thing that telling can do, I mean, it does very much go to POV, and maybe we should talk about that in another episode. Very much one thing that falls under the rubric of telling, but that is indispensable, is when the narrator is, I mean, when you read that Turkey City description, I also get this sense of this very late 20th century lionization of tight limited third, you know, where it's like, we don't want to break the vivid dream of what the reader, but like, then you don't get Lemony Snicket. You know what I mean? Then you don't get a reader who mocks the character and like tells what the character doesn't know, and the dramatic irony of like, you know, and so that's all telling. You know, that, I mean, that's the beauty of telling, and it is distancing, right? You're not like deep in the Baudelaire children's, you know, wondering, you know, your heart isn't beating with every beat of theirs. You are finding the whole thing hilarious, even while they're suffering great tragedies, because Lemony Snicket is telling so much. But that is part of the genius of it.
All right. I think on that note,
and on that
we'll
note,
end.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. We will be back.
Bye.
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 Hey, humans. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Those were just a few of the many, many terms in the Turkey City Lexicon. If you'd like to see Marianne, Ben, and Jed discuss more of them, please feel free to email us at mrahpodcast@speculativelyterature.org. Or you could tweet with us at mrahpodcast with the terms that you'd like to see the most from the Turkey City Lexicon. This podcast is hosted by Marianne Mohanraj and Benjamin Rosenbaum. Editing and show notes by Darius Vinisar. Music composed by Thor Bremer. And cover art by Stephanie Bailey. Thanks for tuning in to Mohanraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans.